What I want us to do for the rest of today is talk for a little while about the third greatest philosopher in the history of the ancient world. His name was Plotinus. I don't know for sure how long it will take me to talk about Plotinus. Maybe I can finish him before the break. Then, as soon as we finish Plotinus, we will begin talking about the great Augustine. It grieves me that we're skipping so much here. There's a lot that I wish we could talk about. I wish we could say more about some of the early fathers. But I would hope that you'd get that in some of your church history classes. So, for today, two main figures, Plotinus and Augustine. Now, the attention I'm going to give Plotinus is not incidental to our focus on Augustine, for one very important reason. Plotinus, or at least the writings of some of his followers, played an important role in straightening out the thinking of the man who would become St. Augustine. When we start going through Augustine's life and the development of Augustine's thinking, we will reach a point, Augustine was about 29 or 30 years old, where he suddenly discovered Neoplatonism, and it was that discovery that stripped away all of the nonsense that had confused him for the first 29 or 30 years of his life. What's interesting here is that Augustine was straightened out by a man who was not a Christian. Plotinus was a pagan whose system incorporates elements of both Plato and Aristotle. But this is a beautiful example of how people who are hindered from accepting Christianity can sometimes be helped through a study of non-Christian philosophy. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. So let's write the name Plotinus on the blackboard. You probably, most of you have never heard of Plotinus before. I wouldn't be surprised that you haven't. His dates are 205 to 270 AD. We don't know as much as we would like to know about Plotinus' life. It appears that he spent some of his early life in Alexandria. He was not a Jew, but he did spend some time in Alexandria. There are some affinities, there are some resemblances between Philo and Plotinus. Even though I must admit to you that Plotinus, whenever he mentions Philo, or at least mentions ideas that resemble Philo's, is very critical. He's very unkind. But I can see all kinds of links between Philo and then what we call Middle Platonism and Plotinus. During the 19th century, certain German historians of philosophy gave a name to Plotinus' system. They called Plotinus' system Neoplatonism. You must realize that Plotinus himself never thought of this word. This is a 19th century invention. You see, by the time we get to the 19th century, German thinkers are beginning to categorize ancient philosophers, and so what they had was early Platonism, which would be Plato and the immediate people who followed him, and then there was the Neoplatonism of Plotinus, and then for a group of thinkers who lived about 100 AD, they called them the Middle Platonists. But these terms were all modern inventions. I have over the years developed a particular way of teaching Plotinus that I hope is true to his system. I think it's the easiest way of grasping the system of this man, but you have to realize that it's also a bit artificial. But let's use it anyway. I am going to draw a chart or a diagram on the board. I'm going to begin by drawing a circle. Well, that's not exactly a circle, but it's round, all right? This circle is going to represent the first of three stages of being for Plotinus. We're going to call this stage of reality the One. This is actually Plotinus's favorite name for God. All right? But I don't want to get ahead of myself here. Let's finish drawing the diagram. I'm now going to draw a line from the circle that represents the One, and I'm going to draw something that looks like an umbrella, only at the bottom of the umbrella there are sharp little edges that are continuous with the top of the umbrella. This second circle-like thing, umbrella-like object on our chart, will stand for the second level of reality in Plotinus's universe, and let's call this level nous. Somebody tell me what the Greek word nous means again. It means mind, all right? Intellect. Nous or mind, intellect. Once again, I'm going to draw a line from our little umbrella here to still another umbrella-like figure that also has little pointed lines on the bottom. And we're going to call this level soul. Now we could use a Greek word which would be psyche, or we could use the Latin word anima, but I don't know, I've just gotten accustomed to calling this next umbrella-like thing here soul. I'm going to remove the lectern so you all can see my great chart. All right, soul. Let's also put in parentheses here the word life. Now before I begin explaining this diagram and explaining Plotinus's philosophical system, keep this important truth in mind. Plotinus's philosophy is going to be a brilliant synthesis of both Platonism and Aristotelianism. I've already called Plotinus the third greatest philosopher in the ancient world. He's only slightly below Plato and Aristotle in the pantheon of greatness. It's true that without Plato and Aristotle there never would have been a Plotinus, but it took a brilliant mind to effect this kind of synthesis. The next thing I have to explain before I actually get into the diagram is the process by which these lower levels of reality come into being from the One, from God. In other words, I'm referring to this line that connects the One, the highest being in Plotinus' system, to the level of nous, and I'm also referring to this line that connects nous to soul or life. Plotinus's word for this process by which the various levels of reality come into existence is the word emanation. Emanation. This is a new word. This is a tough word. But what Plotinus wants us to see is that all levels of reality are, in a sense, tied together. And not only tied together, but are tied back to their ultimate source in God, or the One. And the process that ties all of reality together into one kind of coherent system is the process of emanation. It's probably impossible to define the word emanation. It's easier to give examples. So let me give some. Think, if you will, this is example number one of the notion of emanation. Think of a fountain, a multi-tiered fountain. You all have seen them. All right, let's say what I'm drawing here is a kind of fountain with many levels to it. Let's picture a fountain that has a bowl or a laver at the top where the water shoots up and fills that top bowl. And then what happens to the water? It overflows. And it overflows into still lower basins. All right? And then what happens when those lower basins fill up? Well, they overflow to still lower basins. Now, that's one way of understanding the process of emanation. Plotinus is suggesting that all of reality is a kind of overflow of the original being of God Himself. That the nature, the being of the One is so complete and so perfect that it cannot be contained within itself, and so it necessarily bubbles over. And as it bubbles over, it gives rise to new kinds of reality, which in a sense have a kind of link to their ultimate source in the being of God. Incidentally, every time I walk into a restaurant or someplace and I see a fountain, I think necessarily of all kinds of, I think of Plotinus. I not only think of Plotinus, but I also think of some modern-day thinkers like Paul Tillich. Now, I don't know how much contact you all have had with Paul Tillich, but Paul Tillich, who now has gone on to his reward, which I hope none of you share, Paul Tillich was a kind of Plotinian. This morning during chapel, I mentioned my friend Richard Mao. One day, Richard Mao and I were going into a restaurant in the city of Chicago. We only see each other about once every 5 years, but they're always memorable events, or so Richard tells me. We walked into some restaurant in the city of Chicago, and there was a little fountain there. And I pointed it out to Mao, and I said, "Boy, that reminds me of Paul Tillich's theology." And he thought I was a little weird, but that's Mao's problem. He hasn't thought about Tillich correctly, I guess. All right, that's my first example of emanation. Here's my second example of emanation. Think of a candle. All right? Back in Kentucky, they always keep asking me to teach art courses, and I keep telling them that I have more important things to do. No doubt you can see why they're after me to teach art there. Here is a candle with a flame. Now, the flame emits light. Okay? Now, this relationship between the flame and the light is another example of what Plotinus calls emanation. The light emanates from the flame. Question. Suppose the flame is eternal. What will we then be able to say about the light that emanates from the flame? Answer, it too will be eternal. If this flame has been emanating light forever, then the light will be eternal just as the flame is eternal. That observation is important for one important reason. Plotinus believes that the world has always existed. The reason the world has always existed is because God has been eternally emanating, giving off effusions or emanations of His own being into the existence of the world. A warning. Plotinus is not a pantheist. Even though many people would be quick to jump to the conclusion that he is. A pantheist is a person who believes that God and the world are identical in some way. Plotinus did not believe that. Even though Plotinus taught that the world is an eternal emanation from God, he still believed in the transcendence of the One. the one is superior to the emanations that flow from the one. And so don't equate God with his world. They're different. They're different in a very important sense. If you take away the flame, what's going to happen to the light? The light will cease to exist. That which is an emanation from the light is on... Oh boy, what a sentence this is. Get it in your notes if you can. The light which is an emanation from the flame is ontologically dependent upon the flame for its own existence. Take away the flame and you lose the light. And so Plotinus would say, if by some chance God should cease to exist, then the world would cease to exist. There is a relationship of ontological dependence here. Consequently, Plotinus should not be understood as a pantheist. But let me say here, for those of you who know anything at all about process theology, this is a pretty good way of imaging or picturing the system of theology that we call process thought. In other words, I'll get to the question in a moment, you could think of Plotinus as a panentheist, not a pantheist, but a panentheist. Panentheism, the same kind of system that we find in process theology, and I hope to have time to talk about that before this course ends. That's largely a 20th century movement. Teaches that God and the world are codependent in some way. They need each other. Actually, even that is a little stronger than Plotinus would have stronger than anything Plotinus would have said. Now, I saw a hand over here somewhere. Wasn't it beautiful? All right. I'm not sure I can repeat it because these gems just come and go, but let's try here. What I started to say, what are the first words on that sentence? Say, now don't say. What? It's one person. What? What's the... That sounds, what's the first few words?
Light is an emanation of the flame.
If the light is an emanation of the flame, then it is ontologically dependent for its own existence upon the flame. Okay? All right. One other thing before we start. What have we been doing if we haven't started? There is a kind of rhythm to the universe for Plotinus. Hey, don't you like that? A rhythm. Did you see in the paper today where somebody's going to start a new theme park in Central Florida called Veda Land? You can go there and get off on transcendental meditation. The Maharishi is going is the inspiration for Veda Land. Hold on to your Bibles. They're coming. This place is going to Looney Tunesville. Anyway, there's a rhythm in the universe. Mentioning India, we're talking about a system that ended up being developed in Rome that has some affinities to Oriental, to Eastern thought here, okay? Well, anyway, Plotinus talked about the downward path and the upward path. The downward path is the process, the path by which reality comes into existence. This is the downward path of being. But there is also an upward path of salvation. Ooh. An upward path of salvation. Let me show you what we're heading for. Remember Plato's cave. And remember the levels of being that Plato talked about. The highest levels of being existing outside the cave. Think of Plotinus's one as an analog to Plato's sun, the form of the good, because that's precisely what Plotinus has in mind. Remember how the good, the sun outside of Plato's cave, was unknowable? Every time you tried to look at the sun, you were blinded. Well, Plotinus's God is going to be unknowable in just the same sense. And then remember how, as you go down into the cave, into the darkness of the cave, you get progressively farther from the world of the forms and farther from the source of all light and truth and goodness. That's the way it's going to be in the world. Now, what you're going to find in Plotinus is this: all human beings are minds and souls that are really emanations from the One, from the source of all light and truth, but we are all trapped in our own bodies. You are a mind that has a link to God, the One. Just how that link works, I'll explain in a moment. You are a soul that has a link back to God. But your mind and your soul are trapped in a physical body. And like all the Platonists we've studied so far, Plotinus doesn't think very much about the body. He doesn't think very highly of the body. So what we're going to find is that we're all down here, and our salvation depends upon our getting out of here and getting away from here and finding our way back up the ladder, back up the cave, to some kind of mystical union with the One. Okay? Well, this would be a bad time to start because it's going to take me another 20 minutes or so. I think we should take our break, come back in 15 minutes, and then we'll complete Plotinus and start talking about Augustine. Let's finish up Plotinus in 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll jump to Augustine. Picture an unknowable, supremely perfect, transcendent God whose perfection and goodness simply cannot be contained within itself, so that his being overflows. Think back to our earlier example of a fountain. And so we have the being of God emanating and producing the first level of being outside of his own being, and that's what Plotinus calls nous. One of the nice things about this little diagram that we're considering is the fact that it indicates a difference between an upper nous, the nous itself, and these little particular points on the bottom of our umbrella, which are going to refer to specific minds. Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's think about the nous of God, the mind of God. Now, actually, this is a good place to jump in here, because it's really not hard at all, I think, to understand what Plotinus means when he regards the mind of God as the first emanation from God. Because what he's really talking about here are God's ideas. This is God thinking. All right? Here you have the mysterious, unknowable essence of God. And the first thing God does is think. And thinking produces something which, even though dependent upon God, is nonetheless somewhat distinct from God. His ideas, his thoughts. Now, in a way somewhat analogous to that, you can produce emanations of your own. You can think. You can put your ideas down on paper so that they have a kind of existence that's independent of you, their creator, you see? So here is the mind of God. Now, even though we didn't go into a whole lot of detail about Philo, this particular segment of Plotinus' thought is almost identical to Philo, because Philo also thought that the ideas of God had a kind of eternal existence that was somewhat separate from God. Now, in the case of Philo, what we're indicating here as a relationship between God and God's mind, Philo used the word logos for this level of reality. Now, make sure if you put that on your notes that logos would be Philo's word for this. But the idea is the same. By now, you are all experts on the subsequent history of Plato's theory of the forms, and you know by now that it has become a kind of commonplace in philosophy to interpret Plato's forms as eternal ideas in the mind of God. Well, that's what's going on here too. This is where Plato's forms exist for Plotinus. Plato's world of the forms exists or subsists as eternal thoughts in the eternal mind of God. But in Plotinus' system, we get this unpacked as a kind of emanation. All right? So here is God's mind. Here are God's eternal thoughts. Here are Plato's forms. Now, what are these sharp-pointed extensions at the bottom of my first umbrella? Well, the answer should be obvious. Each of these little points represents an individual nous in the world. Now, if that's too indirect, each of these little points represents a particular mind or reason. Now, let's pick a particularly sharp point here. Yeah, this is sharp. That's my nous right there. All right? Now, let's find a dull nous. No, we won't make any more fun of that. But maybe you can find some nooses up here that you happen to know. All right? I mean, this right here is a pretty dull nous. That has to be some kind of congressman in Washington, D.C. these weeks, right? That's probably a member of the House right there, and that's a member of the Senate right there. Not very sharp at all. Notice something else that our chart makes clear. Every human nous is an extension of the mind of God. This is Plotinus' answer to the old question, how do human beings know the forms, the thoughts, the eternal ideas? Plotinus' answer is, the ideas of God are in my mind because my mind is ontologically connected to the mind of God. Let me hasten to add, friends, that that's not a Christian position. That's not a biblical position. That's a position that St. Augustine is going to have to disassociate himself from. But at least you can see what Plotinus is saying. Every human mind is linked in some kind of real way to the mind of God. My mind he would say, is simply an extension of the mind of God. Now that's where you get in a little bit of Eastern thought being presupposed here, being anticipated, a little bit of Asian thought that you can then find unpacked in certain kinds of Eastern systems. All right, next level of being is the level of soul. Now, I didn't go into a whole lot of detail when we talked about Aristotle's view of soul. I do in the book, but I didn't really spend any time in class. You need to realize that when we get to this level, Plotinus is using the word soul not in Plato's sense, but in Aristotle's sense. You see, for Aristotle, soul is simply a kind of life. That's all soul means for Aristotle. is animation. The Latin word, in fact, is anima. That's the Latin word. Now, Aristotle didn't write in Latin, but that's a convenient Latin equivalent for what Aristotle meant by soul. An animal is a living thing. When something is animated, it is alive, it is full of life. Aristotle believed that all kinds of things in the world have life, have souls. Plants have souls. They don't have souls in Plato's sense of the word. You wouldn't go out to your garden and talk to the soul of some tomato if you were an Aristotle doesn't mean that tomatoes have souls like in Plato's sense. All he means is that Plato's have life. Animals have souls, but not in Plato's sense. It just means that an animal has a more sophisticated, complicated kind of life than a plant has. The essence of the human soul, what makes our kind of soul different from plants and animals, is the fact that we can think. You and I are rational souls. We're not just alive carrying on bodily functions, which would be the vegetable soul. We're not just capable of feeling sensations, which would be the animal soul. We can do all of that, but we can also reason or think. Well, all right. There is a kind of world soul. This would be like Plato's demiurge, but it is the source of all life in the universe, and these little points at the bottom of this umbrella represent the large number of particular souls. Here's the soul of some tomato growing in somebody's garden. Once you dissect the tomato from the plant, it's no longer alive. Here's the soul of some dog or some cat. And here, too, are souls of human beings. They are all tied back ontologically to the world soul, a kind of cosmic soul. All right? Ooh, I need to bring this out. When we start talking about Thomas Aquinas next week, hopefully, we are going to find Thomas Aquinas battling for a place for Aristotle in the history of Christian thought. And one of the reasons why Aristotle is going to have such a hard time finding Christians to accept Aristotle is because at that point in the history of thought, in the history of philosophy, Plotinus' system is going to be functioning in the Arabic world. And certain Arabic Aristotelians are going to be teaching everybody that if you're an Aristotelian, you can no longer believe in personal immortality. Now here's why. Let's take this little soul right here. Could be the soul of a cabbage or a dog or a human being. What happens when that individual embodied creature dies? Plotinus' answer is the soul of that creature is reabsorbed back into the world soul. This is an important point for the next 1,000 years of philosophy, there is no such thing as personal immortality for Plotinus. He can talk about immortality, but it's the same kind of immortality that you would find in certain strains of Oriental philosophy, in Buddhism. It's the same survival that a drop of water has when you drop it into an ocean. It loses its identity even though the molecules continue to exist. What happens to the mind of this particular person when that person dies? Does that mind cease to exist? No, it is reabsorbed into the cosmic nous, into the nous, the mind of God. There is immortality, but it is not personal immortality. So when we get to Aquinas, we're going to find that his biggest challenge is trying to show medieval Christians how they can be Aristotelians and still believe in personal immortality and still believe in creation of the world. In other words, by the time we get to, say, the 13th century, there's going to be an enormous amount of confusion where people can no longer separate Aristotle, Plato, and Plotinus. They may think it's Plato, they may think it's Aristotle, but they're really talking Plotinus in the 13th century. Well, that's important, but that lies in our future. All right, so we have nous and soul linked to body. This is the downward path of being. Now, how do we get saved in Plotinus' sense of the word? By climbing back to our source of being. By leaving behind these lower realms of being and climbing up to higher realms of being. By leaving behind, first of all, the realm of body. Listen, the first step you have to take on the way to God is to loosen every bit of dependence upon the body. Get rid of anything that might affect you physically. And if I were Plotinus here, I'd say the first thing to get rid of is this lousy music everybody listens to. If you enjoy music that makes your hips swing, you're never going to get up the ladder to God because you're too involved with your body. So what you've got to do is begin to cultivate activities that lessen your dependence upon the body. I guess that means losing some weight and maybe not paying as much attention to food and things like golf, and certainly not paying attention to things like baseball games and football games. You know, the idea of Christians on a Monday night rooting for the Cincinnati Bengals, that's so obscene from a Plotinian point of view. It really is. To watch bodies in conflict, you'll never get there that way. So disassociate yourself from bodily activities. Begin to cultivate your mind. Study more philosophy. Read a little Aristotle. Buy some of Nash's books. Whatever. That'll certainly lessen your dependence upon the body. I guarantee that. Until finally, and you also focus on morality, you see. You stop pursuing corrupt kinds of activities. But Plotinus says, even though you can climb on this ladder a great distance by yourself, there's a point beyond which your own efforts to achieve salvation and union with God must end. You can only go so far on your own, and then you and I bump into a brick wall. And the only way we can bridge that gap, that ultimate gap between ourselves and the One, is through a kind of mystical experience in which, in a way that leaves reason behind, in a way that leaves perhaps personal identity behind, we enter into a mystical union with the One. So what we end up with is a kind of mysticism in which there is no knowledge, no communication, no revelation, nothing that you can share with anybody else. You just have a really way out experience with the One. Plotinus himself appears to have had this kind of experience no more than 2 or 3 times in his lifetime. This is not something you have every Sunday night in a church service. You don't get up after a Sunday evening meal and say, well, let's go to church and get into union with the One. It happens maybe once, maybe twice, maybe never. And it has nothing to do with reason, or you have to leave your mind aside. Well, this is Plotinus' system. It is not a Christian system, all right?